In this presentation, architectural historian Mary Ann Hunting will discuss the role of women architects and designers in disseminating modernism in the United States. Drawing on research from her forthcoming publication, Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism, of which she is a co-author with Kevin D. Murphy, Dr. Hunting contends that despite the stream of male modernist émigrés in Chicago, women were largely unable to break free from the age-old barriers in the male-dominated architecture profession. By using a variety of professional strategies, like their Eastern peers, women in Chicago were able to find a way to contribute to the modern movement in architecture as well as in related fields including education, publishing, retail, and art and design. In doing so, women spread modernism to a broader, more geographically diverse audience than if they had been singularly focused on designing homes, the traditional domain of women. Architectural historian Mary Ann Hunting received a PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center, master's from Parsons School of Design Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum, and Bachelor of Arts from Vanderbilt University. She is the author of Edward Durrell Stone, Modernism's Populist Architect from 2013, and the co-author with Kevin D. Murphy on the forthcoming publication, Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism from Princeton University Press, 2025. She and Professor Murphy lecture widely on the production of women architects in the mid-20th century. And with that, please enjoy the presentation.
My talk tonight stems from the forthcoming publication I co-authored with Kevin Murphy at Vanderbilt University called Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism, in which we discuss their strategies for success despite sexism in the male-dominated architecture profession. As architecture students, women typically could not get into the established firms as male students did as part of their curriculum or after graduation. And even if women could find entry-level drafting positions, as many in Chicago apparently did, there was little equality with men in assignment, pay, or advancement. Thus, their career pathways had to be at once strategic and malleable. Sacrifices were given, and oftentimes their contributions were effaced intentionally or otherwise. A case in point is the Chicago-born architect Marion Mahoney Griffin. Though she was the second woman to obtain an architecture degree at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the first licensed female in Illinois, and the first employee in 1895 of Frank Lloyd Wright in his Steinway Hall office in Chicago, she later was eclipsed in the profession by her architectural husband, Walter Burley Griffin, whom she married in 1911. The 30-year working partnership of the Griffin couple facilitated her involvement in more large-scale work than she could have achieved otherwise. But Mahoney Griffin did not take credit for her contributions. Not surprisingly, scholars have underestimated her, misunderstood her role. In 1984, Elizabeth Kessler, a former curator in architecture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, wrote in a letter to a colleague about that, quote, mysterious Mahoney woman, concluding that it was, quote, too bad that more is not known about her. Now, I can attest to this ambiguity. When I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I was aware that there were two prairie-style houses in Grand Rapids downtown. One of them is the Meyer May House, built by Wright in 1908. The other, just around the corner, was a copy, not the real thing. Well, that so-called copy was, in fact, the house that Marion Mahoney designed in 1909 for the Ambergs during Wright's absence with his lover in Europe. Recognizing Mahoney's superb graphic skill, he had asked her to lead the practice while he was going away. She insisted on a definite arrangement in which she could have control of the designing. The work of Mahoney and her pervasive influence has now been demonstrated by the Prairie School scholars, including Thomas Hines, who contends that even though their designs were credited to her husband, the Griffin couple, in fact, work as a team, with Mahoney Griffin being a source of ideas, a design critic, and always as the renderer and interpreter of his and their vision. Now, while Mahoney Griffin is now recognized as having played a significant role in the development of American modern architecture in the form of the Prairie style, there are plenty of others we discovered in our research who have not yet been recognized. Frances Baxter Corton was the second woman to graduate from Harvard's Graduate School of Design in Cambridge with a master's degree, no less, in 1943. In one point of her career, between 1961 and 1970, she partnered in Lincoln, Massachusetts, with a Russian-born architect, Konstantin Alexander Pertsov, who attended Harvard in 1924, well before modernism was established there. Baxter Corton, on the other hand, had studied under the émigrés modern masters, Marcel Breuer and Walter Gropius. Her modern training most likely appealed to Pertsov, with whom she partnered as Pertzon and Corton architects, here shown in the corner block of the elevations. To this day, however, Pertsov is still the only recognized designer of the Lincoln houses that they built. Now, this issue of authorship and the specific roles of women architects in professional collaboration is just one of many issues we examine in our book. While preparing for this lecture, I came across the partnership of the Chicago architect couple, Elizabeth Kimball and Rudolph James Nedved. Anyone heard of them? Nedveds? Okay, whose career trajectories were both parallel and interconnected. Between 1926 and 1928, they practiced together in a small firm named after each of them. And between 1929 and 1935, they had a joint practice, although she was a silent partner, with the more senior architects, John Hamilton and William Fellows, who had partnered since 1911. As her story unfolds in tonight's talk, it will become clear that Elizabeth Kimball Nedved faced the same issues as those we researched, who were largely educated in and worked in the Northeast. The journey of Kimball Nedved, however, took different, sometimes intriguing turns, and as far as I know, her written history is far from complete. Before progressing to some of the key themes that structure our book, I'd like to give you a little background and a little understanding of our project, our book project. It actually began many years ago when, as a graduate student and mentee of Professor Murphy, I presented a seminar paper on Ethel Power, the editor of House Beautiful magazine between 1923 and 1933. Here are the beauties. She's on the right. She was also the life partner of Eleanor Raymond, an influential Boston-based architect. Both women completed the architecture program, respectively in 1919 and 1920, at the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which had been established as a professional school solely for women only a few years earlier. Raymond designed a house in 1931 for her sister Rachel in Belmont, likely the earliest modern example in New England. Though unfortunately now demolished, its austere rectangular forms, devoid of ornamentation, with tout planar surfaces interrupted primarily by windows, shows the influence of the architecture of the modern masters that Raymond and Power had visited in Europe after the couple had read to each other in 1928 the recent translation of Le Corbusier's groundbreaking book in English towards a new architecture. Though the aesthetic of the Raymond House is patently modern, it is also notable for the locally familiar materials such as cedar board siding and accents of color relating to on-site vegetation into the design. This integration of vernacular details within a European format was the format of a distinct American variation of modernism. Now, together, Professor Murphy and I were able to establish that whereas Eleanor Raymond was unhesitant in infusing her sister's house and other buildings with European modernism, Ethel Power more cautiously introduced her readers of House Beautiful to these new ideas about design, while at the same time promising that modernism was not going to displace the delight of the old. Even so, in September 1932, she courageously featured a hybrid modern house on the magazine's cover, a radical departure for the magazine. And by June 1934, she was more confidently presenting talking points on modernism. You will note here on the upper left-hand side is a view of the Rachel Raymond house. I wanted to just point out that Power featured Raymond's work and writing in at least 33 articles during her tenure as editor. Featured prominently in our book, these two key women stirred our curiosity and compelled us to spend the next 10 years researching women architects. At the start of the project, we decided to include as many individual biographies as possible, those with recognized work as well as those who labored in obscurity, because they are so fundamental to understanding the roles of women in architecture. Fortunately, during the second feminist movement in the 1970s, a concerted effort had been made to identify the names of women architects, but less was known about what those women had actually built. And since there was limited period of documentation and there were even fewer archives of their work, we decided to concentrate on the most extensive records of women architects we knew about, and these were at the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture in the archive at Smith College, where Raymond and Power had once studied. The school had been founded quite informally in 1915 after a student was denied entry at Harvard's landscape architecture program, and its pedagogy progressed rapidly from informal tutorials and occasional lectures to structured curricula composed of the histories of architecture, landscape architecture, graphics, freehand, drawing, design, construction, and professional practice. In many respects, the curricula was similar to that at Harvard, since a good number of instructors also taught there, including the Cambridge School's director. But the Cambridge School was different in that its small size and female-gendered focus made it possible to adapt to the curricula to compensate for any perceived difficulties the women may have been having. For the same reason, the school is able to respond to the student demand for more complex problems, expanding beyond the domestic realm, which was a stereotypical assignment for women and an early mandate of the school. Now, many women that we studied had some higher education before entering architecture school, especially from the so-called Seven Sisters in the Northeast. In the 1920s, these single-sex institutions began attracting lecturers or instructors who knew about European modernism, including Alfred Barr, Philip Johnson, Henry Russell Hitchcock, all of whom would take on major roles at the Museum of Modern Art. Margaret Burnham Kelly, the granddaughter of Chicago's great city planner, Daniel Burnham, was one of those women who could have studied under Hitchcock while at Vassar, beginning in 1925, before she started architecture at MIT, that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology, between 1929 and 1933. As modernism became more widespread in the 30s, such a woman would have benefited from living in or near the academic community in Cambridge, as it had become somewhat of an avant-garde hub. Now, in Cambridge, Harvard's Graduate School of Design did not accept women until the fall of 1942 as a consequence of the Cambridge School closing and because of wartime malnutrition at Harvard. Among the 25 women from the Cambridge School who enrolled at the Harvard Graduate School of Design that year was Anne Griswold Ting in the foreground. She became an acclaimed modernist after working her way up to associate in the office of Louis Kahn in Philadelphia, with whom you may recall from Nathaniel Kahn's documentary, My Architect. She was one of his muses. Shown here dancing at one of the entertaining Harvard parties, Ting retrospectively wrote about her education at Harvard. Quote, I'd like to think the influx of women raised the standards, although we were frequently and rather ominously told we'd lower them. Now, Franziska Porges, an Australian-born university student who fled to Chicago in 1938, just 5 days after Hitler's forces entered Vienna, found her way to Harvard as well by way of the Cambridge School and before that, Smith College. The cartoons she made of the invasion of women at Harvard show that the male students felt academically overpowered, while at the same time, they engaged with the women in a very gay social life, with the chief attention on Friday afternoons being the architect's paradise at Philip Johnson's house on Ash Street, which, by the way, was his thesis project at Harvard. Neither Harvard or the Cambridge School embraced modernism in its curriculum until the 1930s. In 1928, however, the alumna Faith Bemis designed for the Cambridge School a two-storied industrial-looking drafting wing with the steel frame windows, with the steel frames of the sash windows painted black to read as large spans piercing the planar walls. As remarkably early examples of functional modern design in Cambridge, this edition impressed students for years to come, demonstrated by the designs of Elizabeth Ann Campbell in 1935. On the left, a pencil drawing of the junction of the drafting wing to the 19th century building, which housed the rest of the Cambridge School, and on the right, a watercolor of one of the drafting rooms emphasizing the large windows. Also in Cambridge is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose architecture program was required to enroll women because it was a land-grant school, although women were reportedly not particularly welcome. In addition to Sophia Hayden, the first woman architect graduate from MIT, who won the competition to build the women's building at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, and Marion Mahoney, who graduated in 1894, MIT awarded 82 other bachelor degrees to women between 1890 and 1941, although the attrition rate was about half, according to research done in the 1970s. Now, in comparison to these Cambridge-based schools, the University of Illinois was similar to MIT in that it too was a land-grant school and enrolled women after the architecture department was established there in about 1867, even though, according to the school, there were only a few women in each class of architects for the first 100 years. Women of the Armour Institute of Technology, which later became the Illinois Institute of Technology, didn't fare much better. According to a 1921 yearbook, Helen Fassett from Findlay, Ohio, was the only co-ed in the entire senior class. It was the same for Elizabeth Kimball Nedvid when she graduated in 1925. Her story of enrollment is unusual. After graduating from New Trier High School in 1915, she studied design at the now defunct Church School of Art on Michigan Avenue, between 1916 and 1918. And then for a year, she went to Northwestern University, where possibly she could have been taking engineering classes that then were being offered in the College of Liberal Arts. In 1921, she transferred to the University of Illinois to study architecture, undoubtedly spurred by her architect boyfriend, Rudolf Nedved, a Czechoslovak émigré who was completing his degree at the Armour Institute the same year. She followed him to Europe in 1923, where he was studying architecture on a scholarship from the Chicago Architectural Sketch Club, and where they married in London during their 13-month tour. Subsequently, she was permitted to complete her degree of architecture at the Armour Institute only because her husband had become an instructor of design there. As with male architects, it was not unusual for women like Kimball Nedved to pursue the grand tour tradition of travel abroad, though few scholarships were given to women to do so. It's unclear if Kimball Nedved participated in a specific program in Europe, as the Cambridge School women did in its summer study tours abroad. But women sometimes also enrolled in foreign schools at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London and at the Bauhaus in Dessau or Berlin, for instance. After studying industrial design at the Art Institute, Lilla Ulrich attended the Bauhaus, studying under Mies van der Rohe, Joseph Albers, and Lily Reich. Her investment paid off in 1935 because she was hired by Bennington College, a progressive women's school in Vermont, to teach visual design using Bauhaus concepts. Natalie Swan was also influenced by the Bauhaus experience, where she too studied under Mies for a semester. Swan claimed to have profited greatly from being connected to what she considered the best European culture, and she never lost sight of her Bauhaus training. As her Boston apartment shows in its visual and stylistic expression of modernism. In fact, in 1939, Swan joined the firm of John Rogers and William Priestley, the latter of whom she knew at the Bauhaus. Her regard for the young partners is logical, since they'd already been successfully showing their work in 2 exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art. She followed Priestley to Chicago when he moved here to be closer to Rogers, as well as so he could study and help Mies van der Rohe teach his class at the Illinois Institute of Technology, an assignment that Mies had accepted in 1938. As Natalie Swan demonstrated, the relationships forged at schools was a meaningful contributor to their professional development. Networks of women architects existed in the United States in the early decades of the 20th century, but they were rarely identified as such. Thus, historians here have been led to believe, as Gwendolyn Wright did in 1977, that, quote, to appear successful, each woman architect had to stand apart from other women, both from her few peers and from the many beneath her in the hierarchy. To band together with others facing similar difficulties would be to acknowledge that women generally were subordinate and that the system was discriminatory. The networks of women, however, are recorded in sources ranging from publications of built projects and to personal and professional correspondence and to school communications. The quarterly alumni bulletins, the primary mouthpiece of the Cambridge School, documents a strong underlying web of connections with mentions in each issue of architects studying, working, traveling, fundraising, and socializing together. As meaningful as the networks were to these women, until recently, women's scholars have not been able to categorize or enumerate, much less envision, their networks. So for our project, Kevin and I applied a computer-aided analysis using a process that had recently been used for people to study people in art history. And our goal was to really examine the educational, social, and professional connections of Cambridge School women. The visualization produced allowed us to evaluate the strengths and the types of relationships between women at different points in their careers, such as women in power, who we were able to observe influence a larger constituent of women than we had ever imagined. Now, as with the Cambridge School Bulletins, the 1938 issue of the Architrave, an occasional publication produced by the Women's Architecture Club of Chicago, is overflowing with information about the educational and professional trajectories of the city's women architects. It's clear that many Chicago-based women had studied architecture outside the city in institutions better prepared to educate women. Pratt Institute and the Laboratory School in New York, MIT in Cambridge, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, to name just some of them. Thus, as a consequence of, and I think this is important, of the limited number of women who studied locally, the Chicago architects were patently resourceful in creating ways to professionally connect other than through an alumni association with a graduate school. Unlike those in the Northeast, the Chicago women architects formed and relied on female-gendered clubs and fair exhibitions. As a well-known story goes, Elizabeth Martini, a Pratt-trained architect working on her own, recognized her need for a network, placed an ad in 1921 in a newspaper saying, "Only girl architect lonely, wanted," to meet all the women architects in Chicago to form a club. Well, the Women's Drafting Club she established only lasted about 2 years, but the seeds had been planted. In 1928, another women's organization known as the Women's Architectural Club of Chicago was hatched after Juliet Petal, a University of Michigan educated architect, rallied her peers to create a small but interesting display in a booth at the third annual week-long Women's World Fair, a small but significant venue dedicated to the work of women. The women's fairs that ran for maybe maximum of 5 years were unique to Chicago. Undoubtedly pleased with the outcome of their display, the following year, the club women created another with renderings, drawings, models, and photographs. Sadly, I have not been able to find a photograph anywhere of these things. Then in 1933, at the Century of Progress, some 100 entries were submitted by women from around the globe, including Eleanor Raymond. The participation of such a large and geographically diverse group of women demonstrates how aware they were of one another, which is surprising since women's work was not widely published in the trade journals at the time. This gives even more credence to the Women's Architectural Club's effort to report in its publication, The Architrave, the progress of women outside of Chicago. When readers were informed, for example, that Elizabeth Coit, an MIT-trained architect living in New York, received Edward Langley Scholarship from the American Institute of Architects, she was congratulated and celebrated in the Architrave for achieving such distinction. The Women's Architectural Club functioned much like an alumni association, at least the one at the Cambridge School, though it's probably modeled on local men's clubs with similar missions. In addition to providing venues for exhibitions, there were networking opportunities at monthly or bi-monthly meetings with dinners and such informative lectures as Modern Architecture by Theodor Hofmeister and Women in Architecture by Leo Weisenborn, known for his supervision of the construction of the Chicago Tribune Tower. Now, Elizabeth Kimball Nedved immersed herself in the club's activities by submitting examples of her work to the exhibitions, hosting annual picnic at her home in Glencoe, finding monthly speakers, and providing the venue for the first annual club exhibition in her firm, Hamilton Fellow and Nedvid. By taking on club leadership roles in 1931 and 32, she was, in a sense, modeling her career after that of her husband, who in 1926 had been named president of the Chicago Architectural Sketch Club. In that club's annual exhibitions of 1927 and 1928, the couple featured renderings of houses they completed, all with historical underpinnings. But more often, they exhibited their individual drawings made during their foreign journeys at the Art Institute and the Cliff Dwellers Club in Chicago, for example, or in such scholarly journals as Pencil Points, in which her watercolor of the Cador in Venice was called out for being as accurate as a measured drawing of the building. Unlike their architectural projects, in which the hand of husband and wife is each blurred in their teamwork, Kimball Nedvid's watercolor gave her a way to show her independence in work and in name. As we note with many other architectural couples, the deep-seated common interests and long hours of study and work led the Nedville couple to an early marriage, even before she'd finished architecture school. Although the wives and architect couples also had to fulfill housework duties conventionally assigned to them, partnering with their husbands often provided the only opportunity to which they could aspire. Now, Joseph Hudna, the dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, wrote, even as late as 1951, that given the fixed patterns of prejudice against women in architecture, the most viable career strategy was the husband and wife partnership. Since the 1880s, according to the architect and historian Kate Regev, women architects primarily practiced with their husbands to evade the usual prescription against against married women working. Early husband and wife partnerships, she contends, provided a model for subsequent collaborating architect couples, as well as for the greater presence of women in the field. Though collaboration is a phenomenon that has been more consistently addressed in art history, it was not until late in the 20th century that scholars began to give attention to collaborating couples in modern design, and even then, sometimes without conviction. When Stanislawa Sendeka Nowicki, herself the daughter of an architect, arrived in Chicago from Poland in 1945, using the diplomatic passport of her architecture husband, Matthew, who allegedly was taking on the role of cultural attaché to promote the rebuilding of Poland, she had already shown talent, resourcefulness, and versatility in her production, ranging from buildings and interiors to textiles and graphics. She had also engaged with her better-known husband in various sorts of commercial work, including posters, a popular form of propaganda that Polish architects took on with success owing to their familiarity with modern design. When in 1947, he joined the prestigious Board of Architects to design the United Nations headquarters in New York, Sendeka Nowicki worked on her own, producing corporate graphic designs, likely under the auspices of the Vogue Wright studio in Chicago. At first, it might appear as if the couple dropped their established collaboration with one another in the United States. But closer examination reveals that it remained intact, as the book Made in Poland illustrates, which is signed by M.S. Nowicki, one of the composite names they had used in Warsaw. The same year, the North Carolina State Art Gallery hosted a Nowicki man and wife show composed of textiles, book illustrations, advertising art, and architecture designs, also confirming their continued collaboration. Nonetheless, the prominent critic and historian Louis Mumford wanted to only emphasize Nowicki's primacy in his memoir, though he acknowledges Nowicki as a sympathetic critic, catalyst, and even regent. He never used the word collaborator with regard to her. Nowicki may well have suppressed her husband's early success. After her husband died tragically in a plane crash in 1950, she moved to Philadelphia, where for a quarter of a century she was a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania and won a distinguished professor award from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture and a gold medal from Poland's Ministry of Cultural Heritage. Now, not all husband-wife partnerships were threatened with ambiguity or obliteration. The ones that tended to work the best were when the wives had equal standing with their husbands and received credit for their contributions. The Massachusetts-based couples, the Harknesses and the Fletchers, were fortunate to land such a situation. Sarah Pillsbury Harkness and Jean Bodman Fletcher both partnered with their husbands earlier in their careers on hypothetical designs for publications or in competitions. When the Harknesses won second place and the Fletcher couple won first place in a Smith College dormitories competition sponsored by the Museum of Art and the Journal of Progressive Architecture, the two couples pooled their prize money to support the creation of a new form shortly thereafter in 1945 called the Architects Collaborative. The firm's unprecedented proclamation of equal collaboration among its 8 architect partners was called out not only in the name of the firm, but also in this widely published photograph of them. The collaborators insisted that everyone had a voice at requisite weekly reviews of current commissions, each managed by a team leader whose name was publicized along with that of the firm. Despite the participation of the preeminent architect and instructor Walter Gropius, the intention was there to be no hierarchy among the partners, nor for any one of them to specialize in anything but architecture. Unfortunately, Natalie Griffin DeBlois did not have the same collaborative experience in her corporate environment at Skidmore, Owens and Merrill in New York, a prestigious firm in which the collaborative model was strikingly different. Her first widely proclaimed project in 1958 was the Terrace Plaza Hotel in Cincinnati, an 18-story steel frame structure sheathed in oversized brick. Though she was the project or senior designer, because she was a woman, she never visited the site, nor did she meet the client in person, instead participating only by telephone during the on-site meetings that everybody else was attending. In a small archive she created for herself in the International Archive of Women in Architecture at Virginia Tech, she wrote at the top of an article about this skyscraper, "What if I had visited Cincinnati and knew the site?" While she went on to design numerous corporate skyscrapers, including the new Union Carbide and Pepsi-Cola headquarters buildings on Park Avenue in New York, both now demolished, she was not promoted to the associate level in the firm until she moved in 1961 to Chicago. It's at SOM in Chicago, and where in 1973 she also was a founding member of the Chicago Women in Architecture Club. By accepting a position in a patriarchal culture that emphasized the roles of firm principals and mostly ignored the teams of specialists who created the buildings, Griffin DeBlois was precluded from having a public image, which is why her archive is so informative. Tellingly, she placed an article in the archive she created that appeared in Glamour magazine in 1950 that acknowledges her ability simultaneously to work for a leading architectural firm and engage in pursuits that were gendered female, designing houses, making her own clothes, decorating her own apartment, aspects of her life not known by most. Now, unlike male architects who typically had a linear career, no two women had the same professional trajectory. Their decisions were, by necessity, highly individualistic, and rarely did they work only in architecture firms. Recognizing that their professional practices would not be as straightforward as those of men due to prejudice or to dearth of opportunity, women in architecture found their ways at various points in their careers to other types of design, including furniture, toys, jewelry, graphics, photographs, models, works on papers, and textiles. They also took on diverse professional roles ranging from journalist, critical, and curator to gallerist, educator, and merchandiser. In their later years, many parlayed their experience into city planning, historic preservation, real estate sales and development, or environmental conservation. Although ancillary to architecture per se, such activities were compatible with modernism and that they were often aimed at resolving social issues, especially those concerned with housing and community development. By broadening the perspective on modernism to include not just buildings, but a wide variety of objects and practices, they were able to promote American modernism perhaps to a greater degree than they could have done in architecture alone. Members of the Architectural Club in Chicago were incredibly resourceful in finding design or decorating work at such establishments as Sears Roebuck, Marshall Field, and Mandel Brothers, as well as Lord and Burnham, makers and suppliers of greenhouses. They also do graphs and maps, build architectural models, and design such appliances as stapling machines and ovens. They retouched photographs for Montgomery Ward. They touched up watch faces for Kittredge Dial, made promotional materials at the display factory, and produced patent designs for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Before forming a partnership with her husband, Kimball Nedvid, did stints at both Mandel Brothers and Marshall Field, a frequent place for recent women graduates. Despite being open to alternative work, however, finding a suitable path could be challenging. Margaret Fisher had all of the financial, cultural, and social connections she could have needed, but struggled to find fulfillment or to demonstrate her interest in modernism. As the fifth of 7 children in the high-achieving Winnetka family, she obtained a degree in economics in 1921 at the University of Wisconsin, after which she studied in various media at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, at the Gloucester Art Colony in Massachusetts, and the Art Students League of New York. Her decision in 1926 to study architecture at the Cambridge School, where along with her mother and younger sister, she could be near her brother, Howard Fisher, an architecture student at Harvard, must have appealed to the family. Rather than bouncing between artist colonies and studios, she could participate in a stable educational environment and in an established discipline related to the arts, while at the same time, the school's proximity and relationship to Harvard likely helped satisfy the Fisher family's legacy there. After the completion of her studies, Margaret Fisher traveled the world before settling into a job in 1930 at the prestigious firm of Halliburton Root in Chicago. While she did work on tracings for one of the firm's most notable Art Deco buildings, the Racine County Courthouse in Wisconsin, she found herself unemployed during the Depression, despite her efforts to find an apprenticeship. Consequently, she assisted her brother Howard, who by then was vice president of General Houses and was constructing the prototype of a prefabricated steel house installed near the family's property in Hubbard Woods for her sister-in-law, the ballerina Ruth Marion Page. He also had one of these houses at the Century of Progress exhibition. Despite being prodded by the Cambridge School director to keep looking for the right job so that her brother would not run off with all the honors, Margaret Fisher was conflicted about what field to work in, and painting eventually won out. Fisher And this is one of her paintings here. Fisher never became a widely exhibited or collected artist, but she did apply what she had learned about architecture to her painting, which she first exhibited in 1936 under the auspices of the Chicago Public School Art Society in a small show of women artists. She subsequently sought placement in New York. Although she did not secure long-term representation in Alfred Stieglitz's American Place Gallery, he did introduce her to the founder of what is today the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. In her solo exhibition there in 1939, three of her paintings, Red Barns, Farm Group, and Barn and Blue Silo, were conspicuously architectural. The Chicago Tribune art editor, Eleanor Jewett, said about another solo exhibition of hers at the Quest Art Galleries in Chicago. Miss Fisher, we learned, trained for a time as an architect, and thus, we guess, is the reason for her amazingly fine drawing. With her ability as a draftsman goes an excellent sense of composition and a sensitive flair for color. She seems also to have a quick and vigorous imagination and to be able to create uncommon things out of a common beginning. Fisher thought she had finally found her purpose, given her jotting on a Quest Gallery invitation that she sent to the Cambridge School director that said, "This is just to let you know what one of your old girls is up to. I wonder what you would think of this. Not a T square or a triangle in the lot. As for a shade and a shadow, I'm not at all sure you would approve. I have done my very best to try and forget all that you taught me on that score. I feel like a debutante all framed up and hanging on the wall." Fisher may have felt as if she had abandoned architecture, but her connection to architecture did not escape the critics even after 1941, when her paintings became far more abstract. For Fisher, her architecture experience was the subject and inspiration of her chosen medium of painting. Women architects fortunate enough to design an independent building during their formative professional years rarely had the follow-up opportunities of their male counterparts that enabled them to create an identifiable style of design. Nonetheless, in their one-offs, women could express how they saw themselves as designers, how they could use modern design to solve contemporary problems, and how they could employ its concepts to facilitate more open-ended social roles, in contrast to the previous century, when interiors seemed staged and forced a person to play a certain part, as Eleanor Raymond had observed. Often singular statements of women were their own family house. Other times they were built for weekend enjoyment for themselves or their residents or their relatives. It's puzzling that the singular statement of the Nedveds was not a house they designed for themselves, but rather one that was built by Frank Lloyd Wright for William Glasner in 1904 to 06 in Glencoe. They purchased the house and property in 1928, the second year of their own architectural partnership, a period in which architect neophytes more typically were focused on developing their own aesthetic signature. Why then did this talented, ambitious couple choose to live in this early example of prairie style? Especially because the Nedvids identified with the Beaux-Arts methodology they had been taught at the Armour Institute, and she at the University of Illinois. And he, in fact, was labeled by his peers in his senior year as a Beaux-Arts man. Correspondingly, their artwork concentrated on historical structures, and the buildings that they were designing were also historical in a Beaux-Arts tradition. Even though each had been exposed to the prairie-style interests of Thomas Talmadge, an architect for whom they had both worked, I would like to suggest that it was really Elizabeth Kimball Nedved who most responded to the house and grounds of Wright, because of the vision of the women who created it. Marion Mahoney produced an early drawing informing the placement and the landscape of the house. And the client herself, Cora Glasner, insisted on a servantless, functional plan without a dining room, by the way, a feature that was just beginning to appear in modern homes. Kimball Nedved was the first woman to be admitted to the Chicago chapter of the American Institute of Architects, one of the earliest women graduates from the Armour Institute, and president of the influential Women's Architectural Club of Chicago. As a pioneer in her field, she advocated not just for herself, but all women architects in the field. Thus, it can be argued, she was modern in that sense that she sought to promote and broaden the space for women in the profession. While she and her husband may not have attracted the type of clients open to an entirely different concept of design, as Wright was, their purchase of an early work by the most influential modern architect in the United States may have especially been a tacit indication of her embrace of modernism. The success of women as modern architects is apparent when different measures than those applied to men are used. That is, when works other than signature buildings or major architectural monuments are allowed to count as achievements. Their personal and professional circumstances demanded that they be so versatile that they could continually recreate themselves and be available for new situations. Consequently, the production of women, often made possible by reliable networks of colleagues, must not be measured only by buildings, but by a wide range of media and more by the types of activities in which they engaged. Elizabeth Kimball Nedved typifies the career trajectories of many women architects to the extent that she practiced with a firm after moving through a variety of professional positions, including a husband-wife partnership. Her unique contributions to modernism may have been as a homemaker in a house that represented the work of a great modernist, and equally, if not more important, his female collaborators. Over many decades, she adapted and preserved the Wright Building and its environment while also ensuing its preservation. Still, there's a tremendous amount of research that could be done to fill out the fragmented narratives of the lives of women like her who contribute to modernism in the Midwest. I hope the framework that Professor Murphy and I provide in our book, which takes a broader view of women's contributions, will also inform future research on Chicago women. Now, when preparing for this lecture, I thought it would not be difficult to determine when women were allowed in significant numbers into the Illinois Institute of Technology and how the curriculum formatted by Mies van der Rohe supported or not women in modernism. I was wrong. Nobody with whom I corresponded could readily answer those questions, nor point to appropriate primary or secondary sources, suggesting that Chicago's women art modernists are truly unsung. There's an important and compelling story still waiting to be told of how they contributed to modernism in diverse and influential ways in the mid-20th century.